Well, dear friends and fellow students of John B. Cobb Jr., you, like me, have learned many, many things from this man. But I'm only going to tell you two things I learned from him because these two things were life-changing events for me. The first one, he doesn't know that he taught me. The second one, he might possibly remember. Now, to explain this first one, which really shows me up to be a doofus, somebody really ignorant, but I'm sorry, one learns as one goes along, right? I had started school, or I entered Pomona College as a junior when I was 35 years old. I was a non-traditional student, and all my other students were, 8 or 20. They were young things, really. So I never really had colleagues in school, so I was basically me and my books and the classes. And since I was different from everybody else, I almost never talked in class. I just sort of read and read and read. And what I read was philosophy. I cannot tell you how much I loved it. We started with Fred Sontag. We were reading the pre-Socratics. It was so exciting, I could hardly stand it. And then we went through the pre-Socratics, and we started reading Plato and all that stuff. And after that, you know who came? Aristotle. And then you had all these other people, and it went on and on. And I spent 2 years absolutely immersed in philosophy. I thought it was the best thing I'd ever heard. It took me a long time to read some of them. Others went through fast. I felt as if I crawled inside each head and looked out their eyes to see what the world really looked like. And sometimes I was really crowded inside that head because it was just too small. Other times I just rattled around like this. You never really found anything that was just right. But I loved it. I loved it. Now, of all the people that I read, they all had one thing in common. They were all dead. Every single one of them. Now, I told you, this does not reflect on well on me because you think, well, of course, Marjorie, they wrote a long time ago. And I said, yes, of course, that's what philosophy is. It's stuff people wrote a long time ago. It's wonderful, and you can see how it looked like all through all those ages. It's wonderful. But, of course, they're all dead. Well, then I graduated, and I was accepted into Claremont Graduate School. My first class was with this professor, John B. Cobb Jr. I never heard of him. What do I know? He was just another professor, right? And sure enough, now the books were not just philosophy, but it was philosophical theology. And I was each person in the class was assigned to represent one philosophical theologian. And I was given Carl Michelson, which was right, because he was a wonderful person, but unfortunately had been in a plane crash. And so, of course, he, like all the others, had been deceased. So I assumed that clearly anything that was written down that was either philosophical or now philosophical theology had to be by someone who was deceased. Well, this time I'm in class, and of course, I'm the only woman in the class, but that's neither here nor there. I was always non-traditional. What could I do about that? But other people would talk about their books, the person that they were representing in the class. And I did sometimes talk with the students, actually. And one of them once told me that our very own professor, John B. Cobb Jr., was very important, that he was a philosophical theologian himself. And that's when I learned it. He was alive. I was so excited. Okay. Now, I told you this is a life-changing experience for me because for the first time, there was someone who was being read, and so I immediately went to the bookstore. We had them in those days. And and there was this book, A Christian Natural Theology, and he had written it. And since I knew he was alive, I would find out what a person who was alive had actually written. And so I started that book at night, in the evening. I don't know what time it was when I put it down, but I was finished. I read that all night long. I was so excited that the kind of vision that he put forth, his head wasn't too big and not too small. He was looking out through my eyes and telling me what my world was like. It changed my life. that philosophy and philosophical theology is a living thing. It's not a dead thing. It's not just something that happened a long time ago. It's something that happens now. It's alive. And now it's a discourse that's ongoing. And John, you taught me that just by being yourself. And you never knew it, did you? Now I'm going to tell you the second thing he taught me that was life-changing. If you're a student, in those days anyhow, at Claremont School of Theology, there's one course that is the course of all courses, and it's Whitehead's philosophy and its religious relevance. Now, John, I don't know if I took this course in my first semester or my third semester, but I took this course, and by this time a little more comfortable. I still don't talk much in class. I'm reading now Whitehead. Now, how many of you have read Process and Theology? More or less. All right. I will tell you how it works. First of all, you get this sort of categorical scheme, and whereas Whitehead said, look, this is the way I'm going to put the world together. It's an interrelational world. The world is so interconnected. Everything relates to everything else. What must it be like at its basic core? And he says, well, he was a mathematician, what can I say? And he was also deceased, but be that. He does this categorical scheme, and it tells you how everything has got to fit together. And we're going to follow this metaphysical program all the way through. There are no exceptions to metaphysical principles. That's what Whitehead said. And then after that, he had a little tiny couple of pages called Some Derivative Notions. And among these derivative notions was the notion of God. Aha, process theology, right? Well, I'm in this class, and I've read this, and I like what I'm reading about Whitehead. He refers a lot to all those philosophers that I had read back when I was an undergraduate student. But he had this notion of God that totally captivated me. He had this notion of a God who was everlastingly God, and everlastingly what he called primordial, which means from everlasting to everlasting, if there is an everlasting, that this God is everlasting is better than eternal, and primordial. And that primordial vision is of the togetherness of all things and the way all possibilities could come into existence. But there were more possibilities than could ever possibly come into existence anyhow. It's an absolutely inexhaustible primordial nature of God. And then in addition, there is a kind of a consequent nature of God. Now, you have to know that the way Whitehead developed the notion of an actual entity, which everything is, more or less, in combinations of so much, every actual entity begins by feeling the past. And it takes that past and integrates it into itself, and itself is a new way of being in the world, and that new way of being in the world then influences what can come afterwards, right? Begins with the past and ends with the future. But the primordial nature of God begins with all possibilities, all futures, and then consequently feels the world. Hartshorne, who was alive at the time, was a brilliant philosopher. And he said, that breaks the categorical scheme. If everything begins by feeling the past and integrating it and letting a future come into being, but if God begins with the future in a sense and then feels the past, that's breaking the metaphysical principles. And therefore, God must actually conform to them and begin otherwise. And then I found out that my professor, John Cobb, actually thought maybe Hartshorne was right. There was one problem with it. You see, the consequent nature of God, as the way Whitehead develops it, feels the world. Well, what's the world? It's everything. And we're a part of it. That God feels us at every moment and then takes us into the divine nature and integrates us with the wholeness of God. And that only happens through this consequent nature. But if you reversed it and made God just like everything else, so God begins with the past and ends with the future, then what happens to the consequent nature? And it's the consequent nature that gets us into God. And so that troubled me terribly. But I didn't understand how it would have to work because obviously my professors had to be right. And I told you I didn't talk much in class. But I was, again, the only woman. And you know, women have to be silent. Although not with John Cobb. He never told me I had to be silent. Not once. Okay, so I waited. Everybody comes up to talk to John Cobb after class, right? And I was really troubled. What about this consequent nature? If we lose it, we lose everything. It can't be that we lose it. And finally, everybody else had gone, and I'm waiting. It was a November day. It was so cold. I was standing in the door, shivering, waiting for John to come so I could ask him about this, because surely he could answer me. And so finally, they're all gone, and finally he comes, and I can talk to him. Mr. Cobb, I said, there's a problem. If God if you don't begin with the primordial nature and then you lose the consequent nature, what's going to happen to the consequent nature? And I waited because I knew he could probably tell me. And you know what he did? He looked me in the eye, and he said, Marjorie, I expect you to solve that. I stood there, shivering and in shock, because you know what? I looked him in the eye, and he looked me in the eye, and I knew he meant it. I knew he meant it. And that changed my life. Because what he told me was, philosophy isn't just something that you read about what other people have done. It's not just something that dead people did long ago, and now you can see what they thought while they were alive. It's a dance. And it's a dance that you can enter, that you too can be a part of it. You don't have to just be somebody who reads about it. You can take part in the dance of what this philosophical theology is about. And you don't have to be anybody special. You can be yourself. And by being yourself, you enter the dance of life. And that's what you taught me. Thank you.